Welcome back, everyone. This week, we're going to be talking about social work's respect for diversity and how we work with populations and cultures that are different from us. So, we're going to be focusing on Chapter 7, and you're going to notice some overlap from Chapter 6, as well as some of the special topics. And this is just so we continue to broaden our horizons throughout this class. So as usual, we've got a reading review. We're going to go over language of social justice and intersectionality, and we're going to talk about cultural competence and cultural humility. Now, the book focused on cultural competence, but social workers are increasingly recognizing the importance of taking a stance of cultural humility. So we're going to do some activities in this class session around that. It's really only been in the last few years that social work has really begun to focus more on this idea of cultural humility. It actually originally came from medicine to help doctors work with more diverse populations, but it has a lot of benefit for social work, as many scholars have started to realize. It also really helps us to better really focus on our values of respecting the dignity and worth and the uniqueness of each individual that we work with. So from your readings from this e-class session, as well as what you've read before, I want you to be familiar with ideas of cultural diversity, cultural identity, cultural competence, and cultural humility. You should be familiar with microaggressions from the previous chapter, and these again are discussed in this chapter. Be familiar with the term oppression and marginalization, the terms powerlessness, stereotyping, the ideas around race and power, religion and spirituality, and homophobia. And if you aren't familiar with these terms, go back to the book or review this e-class session again, particularly around cultural humility. So as you recall from our earlier readings and our earlier class discussions, as social workers, we really have a mandate to work with and behalf on vulnerable and oppressed individuals and groups of people. And so what that means in part is we also need to understand what makes them vulnerable. And so there are three terms that in particular help us to understand why some groups are more oppressed, more vulnerable than others in our society. The first is discrimination. So this is a concept, the idea of prejudice and power. And it occurs when members of a more powerful social group behave unjustly or cruelly to members of a less powerful social group. And so the main example I can give you from my own work is with individuals with disabilities. Often they face discrimination in social settings and employment settings. If you look at the statistics, individuals with disabilities are much less likely to complete college. They're much less likely to be employed. If they are employed, they will be underemployed compared to individuals without disabilities. And this is in part comes from our prejudice, right? The conscious or unconscious negative beliefs about a whole group of people and its individual members made without adequate evidence. So in the case of people with disabilities, we generally have this perception of people with disabilities as not capable or that they should be recipients of services instead of recognizing their unique strengths and abilities. And a lot of this prejudice comes from some of our unconscious fears about becoming disabled, right? Or having to use a wheelchair. There's a lot of fear within our society, and we internalize a lot of that, and that causes us often to act negatively towards people with disabilities, and in many cases act negatively towards other groups who are marginalized. So for example, if we look at the news media and we compare how white men are portrayed versus black men when it comes to crimes, whether they be similar or of a more, or for example, the white man committing a more heinous crime than the black man. The images that are associated with those news stories are often more positive for the white man. You know, it'd be him in college or him, out and about. The photos that are often associated with the black man tend to be like a mugshot or in some way more negative. And so that feeds into our collective kind of unconscious bias and prejudice towards different groups. All right, and that then leads to marginalization. And this is when social structures or social institutions are used to disadvantage those who are not perceived as part of the dominant group. These individuals are often denied equal access to resources and become vulnerable to further exploitation and social exclusion. So, for example, we can think of this particularly in terms of race when we look at the various studies that have been done where they've put out resumes that are the exact same in terms of qualifications, in terms of, job history, education, and things like that. And they put different names on the resumes and send them to the same or similar job placements. So, for example, the studies have found that names that sound more Caucasian or potentially more Asian American are much more likely to get a call for an interview than individuals or the resumes that have the have names that are more associated with being black or being of Indian descent or things like that. So this is really, we can see it's in our social structures, our social institutions. And so as we work towards social justice as social workers, there's a lot that we have to untangle. There's a lot that we have to unpack if we're going to be able to really create a socially just society, if we're really going to allow for everyone to have the human rights that they should have. So you've heard me use this term in e-classes before, intersectionality. So I want to take a moment as we're talking about diversity to talk about this a little bit more, as it really informs not only our work as social workers, but it informs our lives, as individuals, whether we're in social work or other fields, how we experience the world, how we are perceived by other people, and things like that. So in a more kind of simplistic way, intersectionality refers to the social, economic, and political ways in which identity-based systems of oppression and privilege connect, overlap, and influence one another. This quote comes from Teaching Tolerance. For those of you in education, this website and this group actually has a lot of great resources. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. Another way to understand intersectionality, particularly as it relates to social justice, is to understand it as an integrated approach, which begins from the concept that people live and experience multiple layered identities, such as race, gender, class, sexuality, able-bodiedness, and so forth, that derives from social relations, history, and operating structures of power. In essence, this idea of intersectionality, and this comes from New Wave feminism, particularly critiques of previous versions of feminism that really were kind of more white dominated. The idea of intersectionality really comes from more of our black feminists, and essentially says that, we are complicated beings, right? And our relationships with others, with social institutions, with society, is influenced by many different factors of us. We all have different identities that may be privileged at times and others that may be oppressed or marginalized, depending on the situation, depending on what's happening in the world. So, for example, some of my identities include being a woman, being white, upper middle class, able-bodied, and things like that. So in many cases, a lot of my identities are very privileged. I'm privileged in terms of my race. My gender, I'm somewhat less privileged than necessarily a white man, but I still, for example, would have more privilege or more access to resources, less stereotypes and things like that than, for example, a black woman. My socioeconomic status as a white woman gives me a lot of advantages compared to a lower socioeconomic status white woman. So again, this gives us the opportunity, or the value of intersectionality is really that it lets us see all the dimensions of people. It lets us think about this in terms of where people have privilege, where they don't have privilege, And it helps us have, I think, really a more in-depth conversation than just saying, white men have privilege. Well, white men might have more privilege, but if they are gay white men, they often have far less privilege than other white men, or if they come from a lower socioeconomic status, a lower socioeconomic background, their access to power and privilege is very different from another white man who has, was the son of millionaires and things like that. So again, intersectionality gives us a language to really talk more in depth about our complicated identities and how we interact with the various social institutions in the US. So now that I've talked about intersectionality more broadly, I'd like you to take a few minutes to think about these questions. How do your intersecting identities shape your perspectives and the way you experience the world? How do you remain true to yourselves as you move in and out of different communities, different cultures, and different contexts? So again, take a few minutes, think about this, reflect on this in your journals. And so for the last part of this e-class, I'd really like us to talk about differences between cultural competence and cultural humility. So what your textbook really gives you is cultural competence. Cultural competence is largely focused on the idea that we social workers need to have a basic understanding of different groups, different cultures, different ethnicities, things like that. Cultural competence has been critiqued a lot, particularly in the last few years, because as social workers, we question whether someone can truly be culturally competent. We also question whether or not this idea of being competent in another culture really values the dignity and worth of each unique individual that we work with. So according to the NASW, cultural competence is the process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, languages, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, religion, spiritual traditions, immigration status, and other diversity factors, in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of the individuals, families, and communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each. So that's a very broad statement that really, it ties back into our mission of social justice and respecting the dignity and worth of individuals. However, traditionally in social work education, much like the book gives you, we're often just given kind of this list of this is African Americans, this is practice with African Americans, this is practice with Native Americans. The problem with that is, it's good and bad. Good that we know some background information so that we aren't totally ignorant when it comes to working with another culture or another group. So, for example, it is important for us to know that groups of color, whether it be African Americans, Asian Americans, the Hispanic community, and Latino community, they're much less likely to seek out or access mental health services than are white individuals in the US. This has, for many reasons, part of it is cultural, part of it is of issues of trust, and things like that. And so it is important for social workers to recognize or to know some of this background. But if we focus too much on stereotyping groups, for example, or we assume that the individual we're working with meets these kind of stereotypes or these standards, and we don't give them space to express themselves or to tell us how they identify with their culture, how they identify as an individual, then we really actually don't respect their dignity and worth. We essentially apply standards or stereotypes onto them instead of them informing us who they are and how they work and operate in the world. So cultural humility, again, this is a more recent trend, is the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the person. And so ideally in social work, we really blend the two. We have some basic knowledge of different cultures, different groups, and their access to services, their, cultural traditions, things like that. But cultural humility pushes us to go further and not assume that the person we're working with identifies with that culture. Cultural humility pushes us to take an unknowing stance and to be open to learning from the individual, for truly allowing them to be the expert in the situation. So to learn a bit more about cultural humility, I want you to watch this video from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. And as you're watching it, I want you to think through these questions. What are ways that you can recognize and develop cultural humility? Think about a time that you witnessed or experienced genuine cultural humility. And I want you to reflect on how can cultural humility benefit you, and what types of actions or competencies really would suggest being having cultural humility to you, whether it be in terms of where you are now in school, whether it be in terms of long-term career path and things like that. All right, to finish up, just a reminder of what you've got coming up. So if you haven't already, you should read Chapter 7. You should be examining social work's stance on racism. I included a direction on Canvas if you haven't already read it. Particularly focus on their discussion of the issues and the policy. I think that's in part one of the more interesting sections to really understand what social work's doing. Spring break, it's just around the corner. I hope you all get the chance to do something fun over spring break. I know spring break isn't as great when you're a student, you don't get as much time as you want, but I hope you take a little time for yourselves. You've got the final E-class in this module, and this is chapters 8 through 10. I'm currently working on that video to really shorten it so that you can enjoy your spring break and you won't be overwhelmed with a long E-class session. And for those chapters, 8 and 9 are the most important. Chapter 10 you can really just skim through. There won't be any questions on the quiz from that chapter. That's really just a more in-depth look at what social workers do in terms of macro policy and practice. If you're interested in policy, it might be an interesting chapter for you to read, but since it's 3 chapters, I'd really rather you guys focus on 8 and 9 and just skim chapter 10. You've got your Journal 2, which is due on March 25th, and your second quiz, which is on March 24th. And again, if you're having any trouble completing any of these things, reach out to me ahead of time. I'm willing to help make arrangements and to work with you because I want you all to get through this class successfully, to finish this. For those of you who are seniors, finish up your year well. For those of you who are in the midst of your coursework, just to get through this semester so you can have kind of a stress-free summer. All right, so again, reach out to me if you're struggling or if you have questions. Because if you reach out to me ahead of time, we can take steps to make sure that you don't get behind or that we do what we need to do to help you complete these assignments. All right, everyone, I'll see you next week for the last, well, not next week since it's spring break, but we'll see you after that for the final E-class.